The cabin lights dim. The hum of boarding fades. A man in a tailored blazer settles into his paid VIP seat, row 1A window. He glances out, not knowing that in moments, everything is about to shift. A quiet request, a forced smile, then a whisper from the flight attendant. "We'll need you to move." No explanation, no apology, just a silent decision wrapped in policy. And as Elijah Brooks gathers his things and walks down the aisle to the back, eyes follow, but no one speaks. What happens when the price of a seat is paid in full, but dignity is still denied? The cabin lights dimmed as the last of the passengers found their seats. Overhead bins clicked shut. Elijah Brooks, 52, settled into seat 1A, second row from the cockpit, just behind first class. He tucked his carry-on under the seat in front of him and exhaled, the kind of long breath that comes after days of running on fumes. He had paid extra for this seat, not for the status, but for the legroom. After 3 days at a tech conference in Minneapolis, Elijah wasn't looking to be important. He just wanted to get home. His back ached. His voice was still hoarse from speaking. His daughter had a school play in 2 days, and he promised he'd be front row. But then she appeared, the flight attendant. Mid-30s, hair pulled tight, lips pressed into a practiced smile. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, leaning toward him, "we have a small favor to ask." Elijah looked up. "All right. There's a passenger seated near the back. He's one of our premium loyalty members. He was expecting to be upgraded, but we're out of available seats. He asked if you'd be willing to switch with him." Elijah blinked. "You want me to give up this seat?" She hesitated. "Yes, just as a courtesy. He's flown with us for years." He gave a polite but firm smile. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat. It's not a favor, it's a purchase." Her smile thinned. "Of course. I'll let the team know." Elijah watched her walk away. Something about the exchange didn't sit right. He hadn't caused trouble. He wasn't loud. He just declined. Yet there was a shift in the air, a quiet tension that settled like dust on a windowsill. 2 rows back, a teenager named Alyssa watched from her aisle seat. She'd been recording little clips for her travel vlog, nothing serious. But when she saw the attendant lean in, and the expression on the man's face, something told her, record this one too. 5 minutes later, a second attendant arrived, older, with a more commanding presence. "Sir," she began, no warmth in her voice, "we understand you declined to move, but unfortunately, we're going to need you to cooperate. It's company policy when there's a seating conflict involving executive-tier passengers." Elijah sat upright. "He works for the airline?" "No," she admitted, "but his loyalty status places him in our highest customer tier." He tilted his head, keeping his voice even. "So, I'm being asked to move, not because of an error, but because someone else is more important to your airline?" She didn't answer. The silence said everything. Around them, other passengers began to notice. A middle-aged man across the aisle raised his eyebrows. A woman behind Elijah whispered, "That doesn't seem right." And through it all, Elijah remained still. Calm. Dignified. But inside, something had cracked. He didn't know it yet, but a quiet refusal, just 3 words, "I paid for it," would soon echo far beyond the walls of that airplane. Just minutes before the flight attendant approached, Elijah Brooks had been thinking about dinner. "If I land by 6, I can still swing by that rib shack off West Boulevard before they close." He chuckled to himself as he adjusted his seatbelt. The thought of warm cornbread and pulled pork was enough to carry him through the last leg of his trip. It had been a long 3 days in Minneapolis. Elijah, a seasoned tech consultant with silver creeping into his beard, had just wrapped a keynote at the Midwest Tech Futures Conference. The talk had gone better than expected. Standing ovation, even a few business cards slipped into his hand afterward. But truth be told, he was tired. His joints ached from years of military service and even more years of airports, hotel beds, and conference chairs. He missed his daughter, Leah, just 14, smart as a whip and always asking questions like, "Daddy, do computers ever get tired like people do?" She had a school play coming up, and he'd promised to help her rehearse. He'd already missed too much over the years chasing contracts across state lines. For Elijah, this flight wasn't just about getting home. It was about returning to the life he'd worked hard to build, steady, quiet, earned. The kind of life where you could finally take a breath. The VIP seat, tucked near the front, wasn't about prestige. It was about rest. He had paid for it, out of pocket, no miles, no favors, because he knew that sometimes peace costs money. As he settled into seat 1A, he glanced around. Nothing flashy. A man in business casual across the aisle. A young couple already dozing off in row 2. Nothing unusual. Elijah wasn't dressed to impress, just a navy blazer over a soft cotton tee, jeans, and a broken-in pair of sneakers. It was who he was, calm, unbothered, never needing to prove anything. He scrolled through emails, sipped water, and stared out the window. The sky was starting to darken, a quiet Midwest evening. In that moment, Elijah thought the hardest part of his day was behind him. But trouble has a way of showing up when you least expect it. And for Elijah Brooks, that knock had just come. Polite voice, pressed uniform, and a question that would unravel far more than just a seating chart. Elijah was halfway through replying to a client's email when he saw the shadow fall over his tray table. He looked up to see a second flight attendant, older, taller, the sort whose experience gave her an air of quiet authority. Her expression was polite but stiff, like someone trying hard to seem neutral. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice low but clipped. "We understand you declined to switch seats earlier. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you again to relocate." Elijah straightened in his seat, careful not to sound confrontational. "I'm sorry. I already explained to your colleague. I paid for this seat. It was assigned days ago. Why is this happening now?" She didn't blink. "It's company policy, sir. When there's a seating conflict involving an executive-tier passenger, we ask for cooperation from guests in non-status seats." He tilted his head. "So let me get this straight. I'm being asked to move, not because of an error, but because the other man has more loyalty points." There was a flicker in her eyes. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe just fatigue. "We can offer a complimentary drink and a $75 voucher for the inconvenience." Elijah stared at her for a moment. The quiet in his voice carried more weight than shouting ever could. "This isn't about money," he said. "It's about respect." Around him, a few passengers had started to listen in. A woman a row behind leaned slightly forward. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The attendant shifted her weight. "We'd appreciate your cooperation." "I've already cooperated," Elijah said calmly. "I boarded early. I took my seat without complaint. And I declined a request I had every right to decline." The silence between them stretched longer than either of them expected. Finally, she gave a tight nod and walked away without another word. Elijah leaned back, pressing his fingers gently to his temples. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He wasn't even angry, not yet. But something about the exchange felt colder than policy. It felt rehearsed. Like they'd done this before. Like they expected him to fold. 2 rows back, Alyssa kept her phone low in her lap, quietly filming. She didn't know what exactly she was capturing, just that it didn't feel right. Elijah adjusted his blazer, glanced out the window again. The plane hadn't even taken off, and yet something heavy had already settled over the cabin. A quiet kind of tension, the kind people feel but don't name. Then came the third approach. A younger crew member this time, clipboard in hand, eyes avoiding his. No explanation. No smile. "Mr. Brooks, please gather your belongings. You've been reassigned to seat 25B. This time, it wasn't a request. It was a command, wrapped in courtesy, masked by uniform, backed by silence. And everyone on that plane felt it. Elijah didn't respond right away. The third crew member, barely older than his daughter Leah, stood silently, clutching a small clipboard like it was armor. She couldn't meet his eyes. "Mr. Brooks, we need you to move to 25B, she repeated. There was no apology. No effort to explain. Just practice distance, the kind you learn when you're told not to engage, only to execute. Elijah looked at her, then slowly turned to face his seat. The one he had paid for, the one that had represented a brief promise of rest. He felt his throat tighten, not from anger but disbelief. Not one person had said they were sorry. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. A younger woman across the aisle whispered, "This isn't right." An older gentleman in 3C gave a faint nod, sympathy, maybe guilt. But no one moved. With quiet dignity, Elijah stood. No dramatic sigh. No protest. He reached up, took his carry-on from the overhead bin, and began walking down the aisle. Each step felt longer than it should have. Eyes followed him, some pretending not to, others not pretending at all. In row 25, the seat was wedged between a teenager in basketball shorts and an elderly woman who kept asking if this flight went to St. Louis. Elijah gave a small nod, but said nothing. He eased into the narrow seat, knees pressed uncomfortably against the tray table, his window view now blocked by a wing. He sat in silence, willing the heat in his chest to settle. Not rage, but something quieter. A weariness born from years of being made to shrink in spaces he had earned the right to fill. Up front, the man now sitting in seat 1A, white, salt and pepper hair, pressed polo shirt, never looked back. Not once. Not to acknowledge. Not to thank. He simply reclined, ordered sparkling water, and began scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. Elijah glanced toward the cabin crew. They were laughing softly now, more cheerful than before. As if the air had cleared. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to keep his composure. What hurt wasn't the seat. It was how normal it had all seemed. In seat 25B, Elijah Brooks sat perfectly still. The hum of the engines faded beneath the quiet ache in his chest. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was disappointed in how easily it had happened, how routine it had felt. There'd been no shouting, no accusations. Just a smile, a policy, and a man removed without resistance. Behind him, someone whispered, "I think they moved that guy from up front." "Yeah," another voice responded. "I heard him say he paid for that seat." Elijah didn't turn around. He folded his hands and stared straight ahead, trying to think about anything else. Leah's school play, the loose kitchen cabinet he promised he'd fix, the taste of that barbecue he was now going to miss. Anything but this. And 2 rows behind him, Alyssa Chun was still holding her phone. She hadn't meant to record it at first. It started as a clip for her Instagram story, just something to pass the time. But when she saw the second flight attendant lean in, her voice clipped and cold, something inside her whispered, "This matters." Now, with the plane cruising at 30,000 feet and Wi-Fi kicking in, Alyssa quietly uploaded the video to TikTok. No fancy edits. No music. No hashtags. Just 4 simple words typed across the screen. He paid for it. She hit post and set her phone down. She didn't expect what would come next. Within minutes, the notifications began. A dozen likes, then hundreds, then thousands. Comments flooded in faster than she could read. "What the hell is wrong with that airline? He handled it better than I would have. This happens more than people think. I've seen it. This is racism in a suit and tie." By the time the plane started its descent into Charlotte, the video had crossed 800,000 views. In seat 25B, Elijah had no idea. He was still trying to let it go. He hadn't touched his phone. He hadn't even looked up, but the current had already shifted. The story was no longer just his. It had taken on a life of its own. Alyssa glanced toward him once more as the seatbelt sign chimed on. She wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe thank him, but she stayed quiet. Somehow, she knew the moment wasn't about her. As they touched down, a text message appeared on her phone. "Your video's going viral." She stared at the screen, heart racing. What started as a bored teenager's reflex had become something else entirely. A quiet, visual record of a moment too familiar for too many. And somewhere in the back of the plane, the man at the center of it all didn't even know his story had just lit a fire. When the wheels touched down in Charlotte, Elijah finally switched off airplane mode. His phone buzzed instantly, not just once, but again and again, like something had broken loose. He glanced down. 3 missed calls. A handful of texts. One from his colleague at the conference. "You're trending." Another. "Dude, that video. Wow." He frowned. "What video?" Curious, he tapped the link. And there it was, clear as day. Him sitting calmly in seat 1A, then the clipped voice of the flight attendant asking him to move. His own reply, calm but steady. "I paid for this seat." The clip wasn't dramatic. There was no yelling, no confrontation. Just quiet discomfort. And maybe that's what made it hit harder. He scrolled through the comments. This is why people stay quiet. But he didn't. Racism today wears a tie and smiles while it reassigns your seat. It's not about the points. It's about the pattern. As Elijah sat waiting for the plane to deboard, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. Across the country, viewers began sharing their own stories. Passengers of color, elderly folks, military veterans, all describing eerily similar experiences, subtle exclusions, policy-based excuses, moments where they were asked to step aside so someone more loyal, more valuable, or just more expected could take their place. Some were nearly identical. A black woman reassigned from a window seat to a middle one, despite being 6 months pregnant. An Asian grandfather asked to switch rows for balance, only to see a young white couple take his place moments later. A Latino traveler bumped from first class without explanation because a platinum member had arrived late. Suddenly, Elijah's experience was no longer isolated. It was a thread, one many had seen, some had lived, but few had spoken about. He looked out the window, the jet bridge slowly creeping into place. It wasn't about loyalty points, he thought. It was about who they thought belonged up front. In that moment, Elijah understood. What happened to him wasn't personal. That's what made it worse. It was normal. And that realization, quiet and sharp as broken glass, was the real story now. Elijah Brooks sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still dressed in the clothes he wore on the flight. The collar of his blazer was slightly wrinkled. His phone lay beside him, buzzing every few seconds like a heartbeat he couldn't calm. Emails, mentions, notifications from people he'd never met, pouring in faster than he could read. He hadn't planned to say anything. That wasn't who he was. He didn't crave the spotlight. He believed in showing up, doing your work, and letting your actions speak louder than your voice. But now, his silence felt like surrender. Leah had texted him a photo of the family dog sleeping on his old sweatshirt. "She misses you." The message was simple, but it made his chest tighten. He wanted to be home. He wanted all of this to just fade away. But it wouldn't. Not this time. He stood, walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, and opened his laptop. The screen glowed in the darkened room. He reached for the webcam, adjusted his collar, and hit record. His voice was soft but clear. "I want to talk about what happened to me on Flight 624. He didn't name names. He didn't curse or demand. He simply described what it felt like to be asked to give up something he had earned, without reason, without apology, in front of dozens of strangers. They didn't raise their voices. They smiled. They called it policy. But what they really said was, "You don't belong here." He paused, gathering breath. "I'm not here asking for free tickets. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want people to ask themselves how often this happens when no one's recording. How many folks just move quietly because they think fighting it won't matter." He ended the video with a line that would be repeated in comment sections and newscasts for days. "Sometimes all you have to do is sit where you paid to sit, and it's still too much." He sat back in his chair, hit upload, and closed the lid. His hands weren't shaking, but something deep in him had shifted. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't broken down. But in less than 4 minutes, Elijah Brooks did something louder than protest. He told the truth. And this time, people were ready to hear it. By the time Elijah Brooks rose the next morning, the video had been viewed over 6.3 million times. His face, calm, steady, unshaken, was playing on TV screens in waiting rooms, break rooms, and news segments across the country. His words, spoken without anger or blame, echoed louder than any headline. "I just want people to ask themselves how often this happens when no one's recording." Comment sections overflowed. Former flight attendants, fellow travelers, and people from all walks of life chimed in. Not just with opinions, but with stories. Hundreds of them. One woman wrote, "They gave my aisle seat away while I was in the restroom. Told me I was randomly reassigned. I was 8 months pregnant." Another, "Same thing happened to my father. Korean War veteran. They said policy, but it only applied to him." And again, the same themes appeared. Loyalty tiers, corporate procedures, and quiet discrimination wrapped in polite language. A day after Elijah's video dropped, Airbright Airlines issued a second statement. This time, it sounded less like a lawyer and more like a human being. "We sincerely apologize to Mr. Elijah Brooks. Our internal review has found that protocol was misapplied. We take full responsibility for the experience he endured. Effective immediately, the flight crew involved will no longer represent Airbright." The response landed like a thunderclap. News outlets ran it with bold headlines. Flight crew fired following viral discrimination incident. Airbright faces scrutiny over loyalty practices. Passengers' quiet refusal sparks policy overhaul. Even more unexpected was what followed. Other airlines, sensing the shift in public mood, scrambled to release their own statements. Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest all pledged transparency in seat reassignment procedures. Some invited customers to submit their past experiences for internal review. Elijah, meanwhile, ignored most interview requests. He declined appearances on the big morning shows and talk segments. When asked why, he simply said, "I didn't do this for airtime. I just didn't want to be erased." He did, however, agree to 2 interviews, one with a local Chicago station and the other with NPR. In the Chicago studio, the host leaned forward gently. "Mr. Brooks, some are calling you a hero. Others say you've started a movement. How do you feel about that?" Elijah gave a quiet smile. "I feel like I got moved out of a seat I paid for. That doesn't make me a hero. That makes me human. Then he added after a pause, "This story isn't about me. It's about how easy it is to be told, without a word, that you don't belong somewhere, even when you've done everything right." That clip aired the same evening. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It didn't even mention race. But millions understood exactly what he meant. And at Airbright's headquarters, behind closed doors, the cracks had started to spread. Inside Airbright's corporate headquarters in San Diego, the atmosphere was tense. Executives huddled behind closed doors. The PR team had gone through 4 versions of their latest statement and still couldn't agree on the language. Legal advisors whispered in corners. One board member asked flatly, "Is he suing us?" He wasn't. Elijah Brooks, meanwhile, was back in Chicago, sitting on his front porch with a cup of chamomile tea. It was quiet out there, just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without looking over his shoulder for a camera. That evening, an email came in from a man named Carlton Drew, a senior director at Horizon Mobility Group, the parent company of several major airlines, including Airbright. The subject line was simple: "We'd like to speak with you, off the record." Elijah stared at it for a moment, then closed his laptop. He wasn't interested in being turned into a brand. He didn't want to be flown out to some shiny conference room just so executives could take pictures and say they were listening. But 2 days later, curiosity nudged him. He made the call. Carlton answered on the second ring. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, "I appreciate you calling. I'll be brief. We saw your video. Some of us listened. We'd like to invite you to consult with our leadership board on customer equity and internal accountability. Paid, of course. No cameras. Just perspective. The kind we clearly don't have enough of." There was a pause. Elijah replied, "Why me?" Carlton didn't dodge it. "Because you told the truth. And people believed you. What do you want to change?" Carlton exhaled. "That's what we're still trying to figure out." Elijah told him he'd think about it. That night, he sat beside Leah, who was busy coloring the backdrop for her school play. She looked up and asked, "Daddy, are people still talking about what happened on the plane?" He nodded. "Yeah, they are." She hesitated. "Are they mad at you?" "No, sweetheart. They're mad for me." She went quiet for a beat. "So what are you going to do now?" He thought for a moment. "Maybe help them fix it, if they're willing to listen." A few days later, Elijah accepted Carlton's offer, under one condition. Every meeting would begin with a real, recorded testimony from a passenger or crew member, read aloud in the boardroom. No editing, no branding, just the truth, exactly as it was lived. Carlton agreed. 2 weeks later, Elijah sat in a modern conference room in Dallas. 12 executives in tailored suits stared back at him across a long, polished table. The lights were bright. The air smelled like lemon-scented glass cleaner and expensive silence. At the head of the meeting, a young executive asked, "Mr. Brooks, do you think the public overreacted?" Elijah met her eyes. Calm. Clear. "No. I think the public was just waiting for an example they could finally see." The room went quiet. From there, the conversation shifted. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't scold. He told stories. He spoke about how racial bias doesn't always arrive as a slur. Sometimes it wears a uniform and says it's policy. Sometimes it leans in with a smile and calls injustice a seating adjustment. By the end of the month, Elijah had helped draft a new protocol known as the Seat Fairness Framework, a plain language policy limiting involuntary seat changes regardless of loyalty tiers. It was adopted not only by Airbright, but later by 2 more airlines. Even the FAA cited it during an internal review of equity practices in commercial air travel. Elijah didn't get rich from it. He wasn't interested in endorsements or speaking tours. He still wore the same old watch, still drove his hybrid sedan with the squeaky air vent. But sometimes, in his inbox, he'd find messages that reminded him why he said yes. One came from a high school teacher in Missouri. "I show your interview to my students when we talk about dignity and change. I tell them you don't have to shout. Just stay where you are if you've earned that space." Elijah printed that email and taped it to the inside of his desk drawer. He hadn't asked for this role. He hadn't auditioned for it. But somehow, by staying seated when the world expected him to move, he'd carved out a space no one could take from him. And it all started with 7 quiet words. "I'm not moving. I paid for this." The ripple effects didn't fade, they deepened. By the time autumn rolled in, the Seat Fairness Framework had been formally adopted by 2 more major carriers. The Department of Transportation published new guidelines on equity in airline seating, citing Elijah's experience by name, not as a scandal, but as a catalyst. Inside the industry, the language began to shift. What used to be called reassignment due to loyalty conflict was now flagged internally as a priority override alert, a term flagged for manual review instead of automatic enforcement. It wasn't perfect, but it was change. And change, Elijah knew, often came slow, and only when someone stopped moving. Elijah never sought credit. He still kept his morning routine. Coffee at 6, a jog if his knees allowed it, then the quiet work he'd always done. When friends called to congratulate him, he'd chuckle and say, "All I did was sit down." But for many, that act meant more than words ever could. One weekend, his daughter Leah came into the kitchen holding a folded copy of a national magazine. "Daddy," she said, "you're in this." He looked up from his coffee. "What is it?" She flipped to a full-page spread. The headline read, "A Seat Taken. How One Passenger Quietly Changed an Industry." There was a photo, not of Elijah giving a speech or shaking hands, but just sitting in a chair, back straight, eyes calm. Not heroic, just steady. Leah sat across from him at the table. "Why do you think they picked you?" she asked. Elijah thought for a moment. "Maybe because I didn't flinch. Maybe because I didn't turn it into a show." She tilted her head. "Is that why you talked on video? Because you didn't want them to get away with it?" He nodded slowly. "That, and because if I didn't speak, maybe the next person wouldn't either." Leah leaned forward, serious now. "So what happens if it happens again?" He smiled gently. "Then somebody else speaks up. Maybe louder. Maybe faster." The following month, Airbright's CEO appeared at a live press conference. For the first time, he addressed the incident without dodging accountability. "We failed," he said plainly. "Not just one passenger, but a principle. What happened to Mr. Elijah Brooks should never have happened. We are not changing because we were forced to. We're changing because we needed to." Few believed it was entirely sincere. But even skeptics admitted, it was rare to hear anything close to that level of honesty from a corporate podium. Other airlines felt the pressure. JetBlue, Delta, Alaska, and even smaller regional carriers issued internal memos reviewing seat policies. Some allowed passengers to submit written accounts of past mistreatment for review. Several crews came forward anonymously, admitting they'd long been instructed to prioritize loyalty, not fairness. And in quiet corners of the country, passengers began to push back with confidence. One story went viral weeks later. A schoolteacher, reassigned at the gate, refused to move and quoted Elijah's line, "I'm not moving. I paid for this." The gate agent blinked, then backed down. Back in Chicago, Elijah didn't follow every headline anymore. He'd done his part. The world was still flawed, still unfair in countless ways, but now it was a little harder to erase someone without being noticed. The next time he flew, it was a morning flight to Sacramento. He boarded early, same as always, carry-on in hand. When he reached seat 1C, he hesitated just a second, then sat down slowly. The flight attendant approached, tablet in hand. "Anything I can get you before takeoff, Mr. Brooks?" she asked kindly. He looked at her, studied her face, and then smiled. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm good right here." And sometimes, staying right where you are is the loudest thing you'll ever say. The lesson Elijah Brooks taught us, without ever raising his voice. In a world that seems to reward noise, shouting on cable news, finger-pointing on social media, an outrage that burns hot but fades fast, Elijah Brooks showed us something different. Something older. Something deeper. He showed us the power of stillness. Elijah didn't storm off the plane. He didn't slam his bag down or shout down a flight attendant. He didn't threaten to sue or demand compensation. When they asked him to give up the seat he'd paid for, the seat that represented not luxury but dignity, he simply said, "I'm not moving. I paid for this." That was all. 7 words. Calm. Steady. And somehow, those 7 words cracked open a conversation this country has needed for a long time. Because what happened to Elijah Brooks wasn't just about a seat. It was about the quiet, practiced ways people are made to feel small, especially when they're black or poor, or don't fit someone's idea of who belongs up front. No slurs were used. No shouting match broke out. But something cruel still happened. It happened through policy, through politeness, through silence. And yet, Elijah met that silence with something stronger, presence. He stayed in his seat until they made him move. Then after they did, he sat quietly, head high, back straight, as the world began to notice what had happened. Not because he screamed for attention, but because he refused to disappear. There's a lesson in that for all of us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to remember other quiet revolutions. Rosa Parks didn't throw a fit on that Montgomery bus. She just stayed seated. Millions marched on Washington not with fists, but with signs and folded hands. The most powerful moments in our history aren't always loud. They're principled. Elijah's story reminds us that dignity is not a performance. It's a choice, a posture. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is not move, not apologize, not accept what's being done to you quietly, especially when you've done everything right. And maybe that's the heart of this story. He earned that space, and they tried to take it from him, not with force, but with a smile and a clipboard. But thanks to one young girl who hit record, and one man who wouldn't fold, the world saw what it looks like when dignity stands its ground. So here's the lesson. Sometimes, you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes you just have to stay right where you are, and let the truth do the talking. And in an age full of noise, that kind of strength, that's what real power still looks like. What would you have done if you were in Elijah's seat, literally and figuratively? Have you ever been asked to quietly step aside, not because you were wrong, but because someone else was seen as more important? Share your thoughts, your stories, or even your silence in the comments. Sometimes, the conversations we start are louder than the voices that try to ignore us.